So before we move to the concept of robustness, I wanted to take this material from a related paper that I already mentioned, Andires et al. With Marco Jansen, the co-author here, and Eleanor Ostrom, whose work we are generally discussing. It's about things called social ecological systems, which are consistent with what we are calling here infrastructures, coupled infrastructures. So entities involved in social ecological systems, and this I'm prepping for a concept called robustness, which came out of this work as well. So what are the entities involved in social ecological systems? You have resources, resource users, public infrastructure providers, public infrastructure, and external environment. So this fits very well into the IAD framework that we just talked about. And examples for each, of course, water source, fishery are examples of resources, and potential problems here are uncertainties, complexities, versus, and as well as, water resources have uncertainties in terms of rainfall and extraction of groundwater and so on. Fisheries have complexity associated with them as well as the uncertainty. There are many ideas on fisheries and how to actually manage them better. When you keep catching one species like tuna or salmon or sardines, anchovies, whatever, you end up chewing down the food web, because tuna eats some prey fish. If you keep catching tuna, then the prey fish can grow in large numbers, because now there is no predation pressure from the top. Then they begin to chew down the web below. So it's called fishing down the food web, and that can be part of the fisheries complexity as well. Of course, now we have perturbations, acidification, sea level rise, deoxygenation, warming, and so on. Resource users can be farmers using irrigation, or fishers harvesting from inshore fisheries as an example. So here you have potential problems of stealing water, getting a free ride on maintenance, etc., that we talked about before. The examples of farmers in Nepal maintaining irrigation systems by monitoring together and working together. And of course, fisheries are already affected by over-harvesting, so it doesn't matter whether you're inshore or offshore or in the open ocean. Public infrastructure providers include Executive and Council of Local Users Association, government bureaus, and so on. So you have internal conflict or indecision about which policies to adopt as a potential problem, or information loss in terms of infrastructure. Public infrastructure examples, engineering works and institutional rules that you have to deal with, and you have, of course, wear out over time. So maintaining infrastructure is a potential problem that we already just mentioned. Memory loss over time and deliberate cheating in terms of institutional loss. Potential problems and institutional rules. External environments include weather, economy, political systems, which can have sudden changes as well as slow changes that are not noticed. So you have chronic changes like sea level rise, warming temperatures, reducing rainfalls, increasing winds, whatever else is relevant for infrastructure in this case. And you have storms, extreme rainfall events, heat waves, etc. as well coming in, right? What are the links involved in social ecological systems? So you have a conceptual diagram here. So conceptual model of social ecological system. You have resource users, public infrastructure providers, and public infrastructure itself. And public infrastructure affects the resource in terms of exploitation, etc. You have external forces happening in each case, and you have resource users depending on the resource itself, as well as public infrastructure providers, and there are two-way arrows, so they are feedbacks, and these interact with public infrastructure as well as resource users, and you have other feedbacks here. You can think of these links in this way. Between resource and resource users, you have availability of water at the time of need, or availability of fish with too much or too little water, too many uneconomic fish too many valued fish. Both can be an issue. Between users and public infrastructure providers, you can have voting for providers, contributing resources, recommending policies, monitoring performance of providers, and you have problems of indeterminacy, lack of participation, free riding, which we talked about, rent seeking, so unfair practices, and lack of information and free riding. The third one is between public infrastructure providers and public infrastructure. So here you have this feedback here. Building initial structure, regular maintenance, monitoring and enforcing rules. Overcapitalization or undercapitalization can be problems, as well as shirking, disrupting temporal and spatial patterns of resource use and cost, as well as corruption, which is very common when it comes to big infrastructure projects and infrastructure providers. Between public infrastructure and resource, impact of infrastructure itself on the resource level, in the sense that it can be ineffective in sustaining the commons or in harvesting the commons sustainably. Between public infrastructure and resource dynamics, you have impact of infrastructure on the feedback structure of the resource harvest dynamic, which again can be ineffective or can have unintended consequences in terms of the infrastructure itself disrupting, let's say, the fisheries or the water availability and so on. Between resource users and public infrastructure, co-production of infrastructure itself, maintenance of works, monitoring and sanctioning are the examples in terms of interactions or links, and you have potential problems of having no incentives or free riding again. Finally, coming closer, external forces on the resource and infrastructure, severe weather, earthquake, landslide, and new roads. So we talked in adaptation about acceptable risks and unacceptable risks. So severe weather has to be an acceptable risk for the infrastructure provider, but earthquake can be an unacceptable risk. Severe weather has to be an unacceptable risk. Earthquake can be an acceptable risk, in which case government has to repair if there is earthquake damage and so on. So these can destroy resources and infrastructure as potential problems. And finally, external forces on social actors. So major changes in political system, migration, commodity prices and regulations. Here you have problems of conflict, uncertainty, migration, greatly increased demand, either due to migration or due to commodity prices and other changes as well. So entities involved in social, I went in the wrong direction there. So that's our diagram here with the various interactions that we just mentioned and the external forces for each one of them. So in terms of design principles derived from studies of long enduring institutions for governing sustainable resources. We already looked at this in terms of designing principles, but let's revisit them here before going to robustness from the book. Clearly defined boundaries. The boundaries of the resource system, such as irrigation system or fishery that we just mentioned, and the individuals or household with rights to harvest resource units are clearly defined. This is something we defined before, and this is also important in terms of the action arena, action situation, rules and participants, and of course in the context of linked systems here or coupled infrastructure. Proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So rules specifying the amount of resource products that a user is allocated are related to local conditions and to rules requiring labor, materials and or money inputs. So you're part of the maintenance system overall, right? Collective choice arrangements. Most individuals affected by harvesting and protection rules are included in the group who can modify these rules. You often refer to it as stakeholder engagement or agency, so that you have the ability to and the willingness. If you have the willingness, you have the ability to act. Monitoring. Monitors who actively audit biophysical conditions and user behavior are at least partially accountable to the users and are often the users themselves. Graduated sanctions. Users who violate rules in use are likely to receive graduated sanctions depending on the seriousness and context of the offense from other users, from officials accountable to these users, or from both. So we talked about metaphors from soccer games where you get the yellow card and then the red card and so on. Conflict resolution mechanisms are always critical for design principles for governing sustainable resources. Users and their officials have rapid access to low-cost local arenas to resolve conflict among users or between users and officials, and minimal recognition of rights to organize. The rights of users to devise their own institutions are not challenged by external governmental authorities, and users have the long-term tenure rights to the resource. This is discussed in many contexts, many action arenas where you have rights to organize, also obviously corresponding to unions and coffee shops, graduate students, union workers in manufacturing industries, auto workers, and so on, are all in this sense part of the coupled infrastructure problem and the governing them sustainably. For resources that are part of the larger systems, nested enterprises that we have talked about before, appropriation, provision, monitoring, enforcement, conflict resolution, and governance activities are organized in multiple layers of nested enterprises. So if you talk about fisheries, you have local fishing managing organizations, ports that manage landings. Fishermen have the rules to follow, bycatch, etc., seasons to follow, and so on and so forth. And there are conflict resolution mechanisms and enforcements, as we talked about it before. Sometimes you have observer on each fishing boat, and you have a valuable resource to be managed, and so on. So these are some things we looked at before, but I wanted to revisit in this context of discussing the robustness of coupled infrastructure systems. So I will leave this podcast here separately as a placeholder for going forward, and these concepts we just discussed are the designing principles especially, are some things we have already looked at, but it's worth repeating them here. So we'll come back and look at what the formal definition of robustness is. We've talked about it before in terms of building an aircraft, how it has to withstand the shocks of flying around, and how it is different from resilience. Okay, so we'll come back and discuss that.